singer-songwriter, and if you ever want to look at the other albums I've mentioned some albums which I think probably are quite interesting as well. As number 25 was D'Angelo's Brown Sugar, and number 31 I've mentioned is Maxwell's Urban Hang Suite. Now this artist we know from the 80s, and this is George Michael. George Michael was in a group called Wham, then he did Careless Whisper, and then he did the album which was very successful, which was called Faith, which had Faith, Father Figure, I Want Your Sex and stuff like that. And that album was massively huge. It was the first time a British white artist had won the R&B Album of the Year for the Grammys, and he did that very well, but then he didn't like the way he was marketed, so he did the Prejudice without I can't think of the second album anyway, but this is the third album, and he'd left Sony Records and he did this with Virgin, and this was the third album called Older, released in 1996, and it was the American release was released one day later than Europe and done by DreamWorks Records, and it was the first album. Listen Without Prejudice was the album from 1990, and in that 5.5 year gap was due to legal battle that Michael experienced with a record label Sony. So so he was recording already prior to that, and most of it was home studio, working with things, and he did a reissue called the Older and Upper album as well. Now, following the release of Listen Without Prejudice, because of he felt Sony's failed to promote the album and the support for the sales, so forth, he went into it's a legal battle. So when he then did the Older album, George Michael was experimenting with different styles. So he was working more on with the jazz flavour of the album sound, very different to the Faith album, and very different to Listen Without Prejudice. But you've got to remember, George Michael was always a lounge singer. That's what he did before, he did Wham. He was always, he loved that stuff. Also with the album, it's not so synthesized. There's a lot of organic sounds. I think there were samples as well, quite a lot of sample stuff. Uses brass and strings, and George Michael was influenced by the Brazilian composer Antonio Carlos Jobim, and he died in 1994, so he was quite influenced by that. But also it is linked to, when we understand about George Michael, the album is about his lover who died of HIV, and he was Brazilian, so this probably where he lived in Brazil, did all that, and he got influenced by that music, so probably it was the boyfriend who died with him. And there's a lot of this album, because at that time George Michael still hadn't come out as homosexual, but obviously you can listen to if you listen to the lyrics, you can hear there's definitely this, you can hear the idea of it, it just hadn't come out. And then he talks about all these ideas of stuff he'd done. So the guy he worked with on this album was a guy called Johnny Douglas, and he'd mixed some of George Michael's B-sides. He's an English producer, and co-wrote and produced Fastlove, and the album is dedicated to Anselmofeleppa, who was Michael's lover, who died from AIDS before the release of the album. And I think the influence of that definitely made it heartfelt. So a lot of, maybe he'd done a lot of production, but the actual vocals were done there. And George Michael also looked very different when he came out with this album. It was dramatic change. He was a lot more sleek, melancholic, dark and sad. Beard, jeans, not the long blonde hair. He had a buzz cut, mostly leather clothes, and so he felt that he wanted to do that. Now, actually, George Michael mentions later on in his life, when he was talking about the album, that he was telling people that it was okay to be gay, and he kind of wanted to look more gay in that look. Again, don't want to keep talking about the homosexuality, but I think it is important to understand it. And then he obviously grew his hair longer back again. But the one thing about Older as an album is, when we're talking about music, is the songwriting. The songwriting, and this is one of the things with George Michael, he's a great songwriter. Very heartfelt, writes these amazing songs which are really poignant, very autobiographical again. And Older did very well in Europe. Didn't do so well in the States. I think it was more a European record, maybe. In fact, though, I think actually when people now listen back and listen to it, they think, oh, actually this is a good record. At the time, it just didn't get promoted very well. The first song, Jesus to a Child, which is a ballad, and that's about his lover. remember that song, and I actually had, I think I've got them all, is all George Michael's singles from that album, because I liked a lot of the remixes, and I just liked the album. I just thought it was a great record. And so like D'Angelo and like Maxwell, this neo soul sound, and then George Michael came up with this album, and I just thought it was beautiful. It was just really well written music, had that sort of R&B feel to it, but Jesus to a Child has definitely got that soul bossa nova, sort of Brazilian sort of love song. Really sad, actually. When you listen to the album, it's quite a sad album. He talks about being older, and he's talking about how he's changed, how he's reflective, and I just found this was I just felt that he really must have heard the music in the music industry at the time. 1995, that was sort of very much the boy band industry of Take That and all that sound. And George Michael really took a chance with this album. It could have actually flopped for him in the UK, but Jesus to a Child, when it was released, it debuted to #1. It was released in 1996, and it actually replaced Michael Jackson's Earth Song, and it was a #1 single since A Different Corner. It was a ballad. It could be seen as like a jazz song, and just this really heartfelt thing. And people actually, when that song came out, Jesus Child, people couldn't believe how good the song was. And it's only when people went, "Oh, it's George Michael," they were like, "Really?" It's like, because people just thought he'd gone off the radar. And it was a #1 because it was such a great song, and people do recognise it. And if you listen to it now, it's got this very heartfelt, and understanding its concept, I think it's great. Fastlove, which was the second main single, was released a bit later on in the April. Really like a funk track, used the Forget-Me-Nots idea, and it actually won Songwriting Ivor Novello Award for the most performed work in 1996. It was massively successful in the UK. Really good song, really good funk song. Again, George Michael's really good at writing catchy lyrics, catchy melodies, really good at production as well. Johnny Douglas was really good on this album. And then Spinning the Wheel came out a lot later, which was kind of like another ballad, but kind of had like this R&B sort of feel. You could feel it's a bit more programmed maybe, but again, using the brass samples, using these ideas. Older, which I mentioned again, was a really good track with that, because you had this idea of him talking reflective about the things he dealt with in the 80s and dealt with in the 90s, and obviously talking about his life, how this being this female love throb for females, and then knowing he's gay, and he's kind of talking about that. And it's actually, going up as a kid, when I heard it as a teenager, I just thought it was really introspective. It taught me a lot about him being shy, and I felt that for people who'd listened to the album would have really found something really interesting. Then we go to the other tracks, like It Doesn't Really Matter. It's like a jazz track. The Strangest Thing is kind of a bit more, very much of like, you can imagine Simply Red or someone else doing that track. Star People is sort of George Michael's humour of how he digs at the famous people, because George Michael, though he was famous, he was always sarcastic about that whole fame thing, and he kind of didn't like it. And so actual George Michael was more privately, in his private life, was actually more someone who just like sitting at home watching TV and eating, and he wasn't into the fame stuff. He's quite shy. I mean, that's the thing, you've got to remember, this is a guy who was a shy Greek immigrant from North London. He wasn't really to be a pop star. He wasn't designed to be that, and I think he always struggled with that, and I think that was probably one of his biggest issues he always had. You Have Been Loved, which is a beautiful jazz song. Again, one thing about this album, if you really want to hear how great it is live, is you need to listen to the old George Michael Unplugged MTV session, and he does this album mainly, and it is amazing, and it just shows you how a great vocalist he is. So yes, I think with this album, again, to consider it just a pop album is a bit throwaway. It is kind of a jazz album mixed with modern R&B. Kind of could be neo soul, but just not as much as D'Angelo Maxwell. And I think also then he did another album called Songs of the Last Century, which is a really good album, and it really got slated because it was all covers but done in jazz versions. His version of Roxanne is just amazing. And I feel that's where George Michael really would really want to have gone, and I just don't think the music industry wanted that. It's kind of like the conflict of how Marvin Gaye was. He wanted to be a lounge singer, not an R&B singer. So it's kind of, there's a lot of, you know, the turmoil of this and the torment, but I really recommend this album, and I think it's an album which again has been forgotten about from the 90s. Beautiful album, really rich songwriting, beautiful melodies, and highly rated. So this I've actually put as my favourite George Michael album. I do have Faith later on in the list, because Faith again in the 80s was very influential about songwriting and creating your own stuff, but Older to me has something a lot more depth and a lot more individual, and I think when you listen to it and re-listen to it, you'll pick things up and you go, wow, as soon as you pick it up. And actually now, because George Michael was passed, you can kind of understand him more. I would think this album is probably his most personal about who he was, and highly rate it, recommend it to anybody. Please have a listen.